Hey everybody, welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java Programming video. This video is the first in a new unit where we're going to work on layout managers, and we're going to work on things that have item listeners. And item listeners are different than action listeners. Remember what action listeners, it allows you to interact with some sort of GUI component, and the program will be informed that that component was interacted with. But it only tells you that it was interacted with. It doesn't tell you how it was interacted with. Buttons are one of those types of things where you press it and you know that a button happened, that somebody pressed a button. But it's not more complex than that. Buttons can't tell us anything else. You can tell us that they were pressed. There are different types of GUI components, however, that have multiple states. For example, when you have a checkbox, if it's interacted with, we want to know that if it's been checked or unchecked. We also have radio buttons where if they get checked, they can also get unchecked. And if one radio button gets checked, other ones get unchecked. We also have things like JCombo boxes, which are those drop-down menu type things. There are all kinds of components out there that have multiple states that we need to be aware of, not just that they've been interacted with. So let's take a look at some examples. In this first video, I'm going to take a look at the basics of checkboxes and the basics of radio buttons so that we can move on with the listeners. Checkboxes and radio buttons are very similar. I'm going to start off with checkboxes because they do everything that any other GUI component that we've worked with does. This program is not interactive. It just has a few checkboxes up on the screen with no listener. I just want to show you how to add them to the screen and what they look like. So I've got a frame with some checkboxes on it. They don't do anything yet. You can see that I can interact with them. Our program is our basic GUI template. It extends JFrame. Here, I'm making my declarations for my instance variables. I'm declaring my JCheckboxes, ch1, 2, 3, and 4. My main method does the stuff that main methods always do in our class. I instantiate the frame to itself. I set the size of the frame, set the layout. I call my create GUI, and I set visible. Create GUI, I'm going to set default close operation. I'm going to get my content pane. I'm going to create my 4 checkboxes. Now, instantiating a checkbox pretty much looks like instantiating any other kind of GUI component. ch1 gets new JCheckbox, and then the string literal that goes into the constructor is going to be the label on that check. So if I run this, you'll see that they all have these corresponding labels. See, check 1 is that one, check 2 is that, so on and so forth. Okay? Next, ch1 set focus painted false. This is the only thing that's different from any of the other types of GUI components we've used so far. I want you to watch what happens when I check these ones. I'm going to check 2, and see how there's a little border around check 2? And check 1 doesn't get that. Check 3 gets it, check 4 gets it. Now, what that tells us was the one that's currently in focus. In other words, the last checkbox that we interacted with. You could choose to have it on there or choose not to have it on there. It's totally up to you. But to turn that off, it's set painted, focus painted, false. This will turn off that border that gets drawn around the item that was interacted with last. All right? Otherwise, everything else is exactly the same. We add them to the content pane, and then, we're done. Okay, so that's working with checkboxes. Radio buttons are very similar. Let's take a look at the radio buttons one. Now, radio buttons are different than checkboxes. Checkboxes are meant to set up a non-exclusive choice. What I mean by that is you can check on any number of those things in that group of checkboxes. Okay, you can have all of them checked, none of them checked, 2 of them checked, whatever. That's a non-exclusive choice. An exclusive choice is a situation where you can have one of them checked, but not others. Radio buttons behave as exclusive choice. Checkboxes are meant to behave as non-exclusive choice. So when I check on one of these, the other ones become unchecked. Okay, that's a radio button. That's how we expect radio buttons to behave. And if you make radio buttons behave in a different way, you're going to confuse your user. One thing you always want to think about when designing a GUI is how we tend to interact with GUIs and what we expect as users. And you don't want to fight against those expectations. When we see JRadioButtons, or any kind of radio buttons for that matter, in a GUI, we expect it to be an exclusive choice. In other words, you click on one and other ones can't be chosen. When we see checkboxes, we expect the ability to check multiples of them. Don't fight against that. Use them as they're intended. Now let's get into how we make that exclusive choice happen, because it's not by default with radio buttons. It happens with something called a button group. So my radio buttons basic JFrame is the same template that we've been using for GUIs all along. I've got my button group that's declared here, and I've got my radio buttons that are declared right here. The main method does the stuff the main method always does. We instantiate our frame, set our size, set layout, call on create GUI, and then set visible true. Let's go on to create GUI. Create GUI, exit on close, get content pane as always, and we instantiate our button group. What a button group does is it sets up a series of buttons to work as exclusive choice. Any buttons that we add to that button group will behave just like these radio buttons do, where when one is checked, all the other ones become unchecked. It only allows for one to be checked at a time. So all four of these radio buttons are part of that button group. Here what I'm doing is I'm instantiating my radio buttons. They get instantiated just like checkboxes do. So R1 gets new radio button, and then a string literal goes in there, and that's going to be the label next to the radio button. And then set focus painted false. So I'm doing that for all four of my radio buttons. That's instantiation. Next step is adding them to the group. Adding them to the group is not actually adding them to the frame. If I don't add them to the frame, they still won't show up. This just adds them to the group so that they behave in that exclusive choice fashion, where when you click one, the other ones that were clicked become unclicked. And then we have to add them to the window. All right, so that's setting up the JRadio buttons. It's almost exactly the same as JCheckBoxes, except if you want to have it as an exclusive choice, we're going to add it to we're going to create the group, and then we're going to add them to the group. Now, we can choose not to add them to a group. If I run this, radio buttons will behave as non-exclusive choice. So we don't want to do that. We want to have them added to the group. And there you have it. That's the basic GUI components that we're adding for this unit. JCheckBox and JRadioButton. Thanks for watching.